Science actually advances by disproving theories rather than proving them. There are actually many failed predictions of evolution. We're going to deal with 5 today. The presence of mature galaxies where they shouldn't be, subplanation surfaces that should be eroded around the world, the presence of soft-bodied fossils which shouldn't be there if the rocks form slowly and gradually over millions of years, the inability of evolution to invent things like rotary motors or even a wheel, and the fifth one was a prediction that most of the DNA in humans and other complex creatures is junk.
So with all the evidence that's going against evolution, why don't we see teachers, professors, lecturers teaching creation science? Why do they keep teaching evolution again and again? Scientific theories make successful predictions. Over the years, many evolutionists have made predictions, but has the theory of evolution passed these tests? Don, you spent 20 years as a professional scientist and almost 30 years as a science communicator. You say that successful predictions don't necessarily prove a theory right, but unsuccessful predictions or failed predictions can disprove a theory. What's the difference?
That's correct. Science actually advances by disproving theories rather than proving them, because a fulfilled prediction is actually a formal fallacy, and it's called affirming the consequent, which sounds fancy, but we'll explain it. So an example of a simple prediction might be that all horses are brown.
Okay.
Right. But unless I knew that I had observed all horses, I'd seen all horses that exist, I wouldn't know that was true. But I only have to see one white horse to know that it's failed. It's a failed theory. So that's how science advances, by disproving theories, not by proving them. So if a prediction is not borne out, then it's actually disproof the theory. And science, or rather the evolutionary ideas, there are actually many failed predictions. I've written an article with over 40 of them. We're going to deal with 5 today.
Okay, that sounds good. Now, I've heard a few different terms talked about when people say evolution, and I've heard cosmic evolution thrown in the mix. Can you explain a bit more about evolution and the different terms people use for it?
Yeah, so today we're dealing with cosmic evolution, which is the grand scheme, that how everything came to be by natural processes over billions of years, from the Big Bang to us.
Okay.
We're rearranged stardust type of idea. So cosmic evolution is the grand scheme, and it involves cosmological evolution, which is the evolution of the universe. It involves geological evolution, which is the development of the Earth and its rocks and fossils and everything. And it involves biological evolution, which is the development of all the living things. So there's sort of 3 broad categories of evolution.
Okay, well, let's start with cosmological evolution. Can you give me an example of a failed prediction from cosmological evolution?
Yes, well, according to the Big Bang, which is the favoured model of how everything came to be, galaxies and things develop over time. So young galaxies, right near the beginning, would not be spiral galaxies like our Milky Way. The Milky Way is considered a mature galaxy. And so galaxies are supposed to evolve or change over time, start out quite simple and become quite complex. So when the Hubble Space Telescope was looking way, way, way away, a long way away, supposedly close to the origin of the universe, they kept seeing mature galaxies, which was rather a puzzle because it didn't fit the expectation or the prediction. But they thought, the James Webb Space Telescope, it can see much further than the Hubble telescope and gives us clearer images. So when the Hubble was basically replaced, it's still working, but the James Webb Space Telescope came on board, we'll be able to clarify this. Well, what they've found is, with the James Webb Space Telescope, is that as far as you can see, there are mature galaxies like the Milky Way. And this is a big problem for the naturalistic Big Bang idea of the origin of the universe. It's a huge problem, a huge fail. So Yeah, it's actually much more consistent with God creating the universe like the Bible says. And that would explain why the galaxies are mature as far as you can see.
They all look mature.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty strong evidence.
And also you find heavy elements. Say, for example, the first stars are supposed to be just hydrogen, a bit of helium, and then they're supposed to form the stars with, like our sun, which have all the other elements, carbon and nitrogen and so on. And so the early stars, early galaxies wouldn't have had any of these heavy elements. Well, what they're finding is that these galaxies have heavy elements, the carbon and nitrogen and so on, and metal and so on. They're there. They shouldn't be there.
Wow. Can you give us some examples of failed predictions in evolutionary geology?
Yeah, there are lots of those. I mean, a big one is back in the 1950s, 1954, a geology textbook on geomorphology was published as a major textbook widely used. And the prediction was made in there that planation surfaces, which are the flat surfaces you find all around the world, planation surfaces would be young, less than 2 million years. Now you think, well, that's a long time. 2 million years is a long time, but compared to the supposed age of the Earth, the 4,500 million years, 2 million years is a drop in the ocean.
Big difference.
A big difference. So basically, the prediction was made that these planation surfaces would be less than 2 million years in age. Well, according to radiometric dating, for example, up in the northwest of Western Australia, the Kimberley Plateau is supposed to be 540 million years old, and yet it's flat. And the problem is that why they made that prediction about 2 million years is that the observed erosion rate on the Earth was such that all of the continents above sea level would be eroded to sea level in just about 20 million years. So erosion is wearing the surface of the Earth, and when you've got different types of rocks and things, some rocks erode faster than others, and so you would, if you have all this erosion going on, you can't have a flat surface. You get gullies and it becomes uneven. So those flat surfaces couldn't be old. And here we have 40 million years supposedly, and it's still flat. So this is a big problem. It actually matches the Bible's account of Noah's flood. The Noah's flood would have created these surfaces just thousands of years ago, and consequently they haven't had time to erode, and you see them all around the world. They're actually testimony to Noah's flood.
Right, so those flat surfaces, they don't point to millions of years, they actually point to a catastrophic flood from the Bible.
Yeah,
instead.
and they point to a young Earth.
Fantastic. Well, can you share some more examples from geology?
Well, more in the area of paleontology, which is related to geology. So this is a study of fossils in the rocks. Two are closely related. So this one goes back to Charles Darwin, in fact. And Darwin predicted that no organism wholly soft would be preserved as a fossil. For example, jellyfish or octopuses and things like that. There's almost nothing to preserve. They're just soft-bodied things. So he predicted that none of those would be preserved as fossils because he had the idea, and others before him had the idea, that the rocks form so slowly, so that the sand and the silt that's deposited to make the rock layers, it happens so slowly that there's not enough sediment to bury a jellyfish for it to become a fossil. In fact, if you take today's idea, the amount of sediment is like less than the thickness of a sheet of paper per year. Right, per year, less than thickness of a sheet of paper per year.
It's not much at all.
How could you preserve a jellyfish? So this is Darwin's thinking, you see. So that's a prediction that no, you wouldn't find any fossil jellyfish. Well, you find lots of fossil jellyfish.
Yeah. Wow, yeah. It makes me think about when I've gone for walks along the beach, even as a kid. You know, you walk one day along the beach and you might have the winds blowing the jellyfish off the ocean. And they're all
blue bottles are the things, yeah.
Blue bottles, and sometimes you get jellyfish as well, but lots of blue bottles. And they're all washed up on the shore, and you try not to step on them because sometimes they'll sting your leg. But then the next day, you know, the winds change direction, there's a bit of swell. Some of them are washed back in. Some of them are, you know, they could still be there, but you don't see them. You dig down in the sand to make a sandcastle. There's no jellyfish. So it looks like you really need rapid burial, like you're saying, to really fossilise these things.
Indeed, yes. And again, Noah's flood would actually create the sediment to bury things quickly, which is why we see so many fossils.
What about biology? Have you got some examples of failed predictions in evolutionary biology?
There's some big ones. J.B.S. Haldane was a famous evolutionist and from many decades ago, but he made the prediction that something like a wheel could not evolve because it would have to be pretty well perfect before it would function. So, for example, you need the whole wheel and the axle and everything has to be present for it to function as a wheel. And mutations are small accidental changes in the DNA. How could that create the instructions to make a whole wheel with the axle and everything? It wouldn't happen. So he made a prediction you would never find something like a wheel in a living thing. Well, we've found things much more sophisticated than wheels, like even rotary motors.
Wow.
So the ATP synthase, which sounds complex, but it's basically an electric rotary motor in all living things. And this is a major fail for this prediction. They're not just rotary motors, there are linear motors, like when we move our muscles, there are little linear motors that pull on the fibres in our cells and things to make the muscles contract and so on. And there's just motors that are involved in unwinding our DNA so it can be copied, and these are absolutely essential for life. And he said they couldn't evolve.
Wow.
He also predicted that something like a magnet would not evolve. Because again, what would be the point of having a magnet unless you had the paraphernalia there to be able to measure the forces on the magnet and to actually use it? Well, birds have magnets in their brains that help them navigate. Even bacteria have magnets. Some of the bacteria have magnets that help them orientate themselves. Another big fail. So these are strong predictions by a very famous evolutionist, and they're big failures.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was doing engineering studies. We had this team project. We had to build a minesweeper robot, and one of the things I had to work on was the magnetic detection sensor, and the amount of design we put into that and the iterations and failures, and it took a long time to get it just right. And we've got these creatures, you're saying, who have got magnetic sensors in the way that they pick up tiny signals. That's just the sign of design. Like that's amazing.
Yeah, amazing design.
Yeah. So you're saying there's quite a lot. You said 40 predictions that have failed in evolution, and your field is biology. So what's your favourite failed prediction in biology?
The favourite one would be junk DNA. This again was a strong prediction from evolutionary biology, and the idea is that there must be lots of DNA in our cells that has no function. It's junk, leftovers of evolution. So where'd that idea come from? Well, first of all, they recognise there are lots of mutations happening, and they recognise that they are largely slightly bad, so they're not helping us. Most of the mutations are harmful, but slightly harmful. So if all these mutations were happening and they're slightly harmful, then we can't be evolving and we have to be going backwards. We must be heading for extinction. So they made the prediction that 98% of the human DNA must be junk.
Okay.
Right, because if 98% of these bad mutations are happening in the junk, then there's a possibility that we can avoid this extinction problem from the mutations.
So is this a bit like having a garage where you can do all your experiments and work things out and then eventually go to production and sell it later?
Well, this is another angle. Another reason why they predicted junk DNA was that. They said that if evolution was to progress, there must be lots of DNA available where we can have experiments going on with mutations. And it's like a sort of playground for evolution. There has to be lots of junk DNA to play around and make new functions. So that was the second reason. And there was a third reason for the prediction, and that is that evolution is a messy process because it involves these accidental changes, mutations, and mutations would not be expected to create 100% functionality. In fact, most of it would be pretty rubbishy. And so there were three strong reasons why the evolutionists predicted lots of junk DNA.
Right.
It's a big fail. And the ENCODE project, which involves scientists from all around the world in many labs, published major reports about 10 years ago where they looked at all the DNA and looked at whether it did something. and they found that over 80% of the DNA had some function. Didn't identify what the function was, but just it had some function. And so, in fact, the spokesperson for that project, Dr. Ewan Burney, said he expected the number would rise to near 100%.
Wow, that's a lot. A lot of function.
So compared to 98% junk, it becomes at least 80% functional.
Yeah.
And some of the evolutionists came out all guns blazing against the ENCODE project. They said it can't possibly be. This can't possibly be because evolution says this. Well, evolution didn't happen.
Yeah. Now, some of our audience might be saying, oh, look, that's all well and good to poke holes in evolutionary theory and look at their failed predictions, but the creationists, they don't even have any predictions. Is that the case?
Well, just about all of those evolutionary predictions have a flip side. In fact, many of them are motivated to counter creationist expectations. For example, one of them is the idea of vestigial organs, which is the idea that we have lots of organs in our bodies which are left over from our evolutionary ancestry, which have no function. And the appendixes and the tonsils, for example, are often held up this way, but they're not without function. That's another story. So the evolutionary prediction was the flip side of a creationist expectation that God wouldn't create us with lots of junky stuff in us. The flip side of the evolution prediction is actually a reaction to a creationist expectation with the objective of proving that we weren't created, but we evolved. So virtually all of the evolution predictions have a flip side, which is a creationist expectation, quite different. Now, my colleague, Dr. Carl Whelan, back in 1994, made the prediction that most of the human DNA would be functional. He said, because we live in a fallen world where human sin and rebellion against God means that he's withdrawn some of his sustaining power from the creation, there would be some non-functional DNA, some damaged DNA, but not very much. And so he made a prediction that real science would actually find the function of the DNA, and that's what's happened. It's proven correct. And so that's one. There are many others. For example, in geology, creationist geologists predicted that the diffusion rate of helium in zircons would be 100,000 times what the evolutionists said it was, based on their belief that the Earth is only 6,000 years old. And guess who was right?
The creationists?
Yeah, they sent it off to the lab, and a couple of years later got the result back, and the creationists were correct. Another one, a creationist predicted that diamonds would contain carbon-14.
Okay.
Now, diamonds are supposed to be billions of years old, and they couldn't possibly have any carbon-14 present if they were billions of years old, because you can't put carbon-14 into a diamond after it's made.
Right.
There's all this crystal structures full. So guess what? Diamonds do have carbon-14 in them.
Right. Wow.
Another prediction that if you take all the coal samples across hundreds of millions of years and you look at them, you would find that there's the same amount of carbon-14 present in all of them. And the evolutionists would say, first of all, there's no carbon-14, and secondly, there couldn't possibly be the same amount. Guess what? It's the same amount, and there's carbon-14 present.
Yeah.
Dr. Russ Humphreys made the prediction about Uranus, the outer planet, that it would have a magnetic field, and he predicted what the magnetic field would be. The evolutionary astronomers said, Uranus would have no magnetic field because it's too old and too dead, after billions of years. 2 years later, Voyager 2 flew past Uranus. Guess what? It had a magnetic field, and almost exactly what Dr. Humphreys predicted.
Wow, that's pretty impressive to predict something, physics to do with something that's a long way out in space. That's amazing. Yeah. I was actually chatting to Dr. Taz Walker the other day, and he mentioned another example which I thought was fascinating. He was talking about opals, and there was a creation scientist, he was a creationist opal miner, and with a bit of science background, and he thought, I don't believe people when they say opals take millions of years to form. So he actually went out to try and make his own opals, And he found a process in jam jars and some special liquid and sediment to start making opal in a matter of weeks. And I thought that's fantastic that with that biblical understanding of history, he could actually make a prediction, do some real science, and it came true. And I just thought that was such a great, so many good examples.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, the whole junk DNA thing has harmed science because it's said to scientists, you don't have to look at this because it's got no function. And so for decades, basically, the whole junk DNA paradigm has harmed the progress of science. And it's crazy, it's unraveling, and scientists are being forced basically to recognise that this so-called junk is not junk. Well, one of the things they found was that when they started looking at the genetic basis of cancer, they found that cancers were caused by mutations in the junk DNA. We say, oh, hang on, if mutations in the junk DNA cause cancer, that can't be functionless.
It's not junk, is it?
It's not junk, no.
Yeah.
So it's really impeded the progress of science. If they'd taken a creationist approach, science would have progressed much faster.
So with all the evidence that's going against evolution, why don't we see teachers, professors, lecturers teaching, creation science? Why do they keep teaching evolution again and again?
Well, some of it's ignorance because they're going through a system which only talks about evolution. And it talks about it in a way which that's the only acceptable way of looking at things. So that's a problem. Ignorance is a problem. But there's also willful ignorance, and that is the alternative to the whole evolutionary scenario is what? There's only two ways of looking at things. Either things made themselves or God created them. And the thing is that God created them is unacceptable to so many people. And so the only alternative they have is to hang on to the evolutionary idea, in spite of its problems, in spite of its failed predictions, in spite of it impeding the progress of science. They hang on to it because the alternative is unthinkable. Like Richard Lewontin was a professor at New York State University in the United States, and he said, we hang on to this materialistic idea because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
Yeah. So no matter how counterintuitive it is and how it's failed so many things, we hang on to it because the alternative is unthinkable, that God created things. And why? Because if God made us, we're responsible to God, and we're not free agents to do whatever we like.
Yeah, it's a shame that that's the case, but it does make sense. So can you summarise the 5 failed predictions of evolution?
Okay, so the first one was the presence of mature galaxies where they shouldn't be. The second one was the planation surfaces that should be eroded around the world, and they're not because they're supposed to be so old, they should be severely eroded. The third one was the presence of soft-bodied fossils, which shouldn't be there if the rocks formed slowly and gradually over millions of years. The fourth one was the inability of evolution to invent things like rotary motors or even a wheel or magnets, and of course we find them. And the fifth one was a prediction that most of the DNA in humans and other complex creatures is junk, which it isn't. So these are the 5 failed predictions that we've dealt with today.
Excellent. And where can someone find those with the other 35 predictions? Where can they find that information?
So if you go to creation.com and you look up 40 failed predictions,
okay,
you'll get the article with references to further reading.
To make it easy for you, we've put a link in the description below, which will take you to the article that Don has written on 40 failed predictions of evolution. Thanks for joining us, Don.
Thanks, Michael.
If you've enjoyed this, you'll also want to watch our documentary, Evolution's Achilles Heels, available for a free 7-day stream. Link in the description below.